بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا افتح لنا أبواب رحمتك وسهل علينا العمل الصالح واغفر لنا ذنوبنا الذنوب التي تمنع الدعاء ونصلي ونسلم على الذي أرسلته بالهدى ودين الحق رحمة للعالمين. ثبت أقدامنا ونعوذ بك من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. اهدينا وسهل علينا طريق إليك. We wanted to focus on the issue of the crisis of faith and the question of whether if it's a problem in itself, in and of itself. Everyone who has studied Islamic history and has some familiarity of the ulama and their lives and so on and so forth knows that we have the example of Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh. And Imam al-Ghazali, he struggled. He was at the height of his career as a faqih, and at that time the position of the ulama, in specific the fuqaha, it was like the position of doctors today in society, meaning it was a well-accomplished position and it had its privileges and so on and so forth. He was also known to be one of the greatest educators in his time. And so he had a following and he had fame and he had position and he had. Imam al-Ghazali in that situation went through a crisis of faith. And some of that at times is documented, but is not really explicated. He questioned what he believed, and he went through a struggle with what was the meaning of his ibadah. What was the meaning of his ibadah, or what was the sense behind it? One of the things that's not talked about much, except in some circles, is that Imam al-Ghazali went through a lot of those struggles on his own. And he had to battle it out, so to speak, within himself. But Imam al-Ghazali, in reality, never really left the Iman. It was a crisis that he went through. He didn't really stop believing. We have no evidence that he stopped believing. It was more of an issue of questioning what it was that he believed, and it was more of an issue of trying to get a sense of meaning and feeling out of what it was that he was practicing. We have that example in the Quran. Mata Nasrullah. Allah, inna Nasrullah qareeb, is the response of the Quran. We have that question of when will the aid of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala come? When will that support come? And this is a very human experience. We ask that at times. Allah, when will this situation pass? Allah, I'm going through this. When will it come to an end? Many people, they immediately come and they say, well, increase your ibadah, increase your dua. And those things are important because what they do is they help us, they alleviate us, they bring us conditions that are more propitious or better suited conditions to deal with our struggles. But sometimes we don't realize that the moments that we go through can only be dealt with time. It's a matter of suffering them and going through them and living them. And it's not necessarily a bad thing that we go through these moments in which we're suffering or we're struggling. We go through them and we have to live them and we have to experience them. In other words, life is not just built out of stability. And this is one of the most beneficial aspects of understanding that Iman increases and decreases. That it increases with our deeds and it decreases with our deeds. The only thing that's left in that is what happens when we're struggling, even when we're trying to increase our deeds. That's part of the problem of what's not talked about much. And we see that people, they go through struggles. In other words, we can't paint our journey in Iman only as being a beautiful journey. We can't use platitudes like such as the Prophet suffered and people suffered in the past and as your suffering is equivalent to them, because that's not the time period that we live. That's not the psychology that we have. We don't have a psychology to just dismiss ourselves. In other words, you can't tell the people who for so long they've been told to focus on their feelings and their experiences and what it is that they're going through and so on and so forth. In other words, people that have been focused on the issue of what it is that they feel as individuals, as persons. You can't just tell them to eliminate that and then just say, well, look, other people suffered more than you. That's not going to help a person in their struggle. And this is where the point of empathy, sometimes empathy with your own self, learning how to relate with your own self, learning how to be easy with your own self. Sometimes that's all that people have in the crisis of faith. And part of that empathy is having boundaries for yourself. Like you have to muster up the energy of knowing that if you go down certain paths, you're going to implode and destroy yourself. Sometimes you have to understand that you have to be strong enough that yes, you have to cry, you have to go through the suffering, you have to go through the pain, but then at the same time you have to get up and you have to orient yourself. You have to achieve your life goals. That's something that's very important to really focus on. Somewhere you have to develop that strength to be able to move forward. And that's the struggle of today, that in the past we were able to just identify with people that were known to have gone through the spiritual journey. And in today's time, sometimes that connection may not always be there because the situation may be different. So the crisis of faith is not a problem in and of itself. The issue is, how are we dealing with the crisis of faith? How are we managing through the crisis of faith? And we mentioned this in other lives, that sometimes the only thing that you have is a couple of words for Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala in dua, and everything seems to fall apart. Your ibadah falls apart. Your reading of the Quran falls apart. Your wanting to deal with the community falls apart. Everything falls apart. But what can't fall apart is a sense of hope. That cannot fall apart. If hope goes, then there's despair. And if despair becomes profound, it becomes difficult for you to come out of the situation of the crisis of faith, and it could even turn into a worse situation for yourself. That's why we said there has to be a boundary that you set out for yourself. The question of when will the help of Allah come, that we find it in the Quran, Mata Nasrullah. We're still asking, when will the help of Allah come? We're not saying that the help of Allah won't come. We're asking in that question, when will the help of Allah come? So there's still a sense that the help of Allah is coming, even though we may feel some despair as to when it's going to come. We didn't stop believing that it's going to come. We just have reached the limit in that type of questioning. We've reached the limit of saying, this is beyond me. And that's why we say it's okay to go through the moments. It's okay to feel the experience of being down. It's okay to go to the situation of the crying and so on and so forth. It's okay to go through those situations. But you also have to realize that you have to have a check with yourself. You have to let yourself go through those moments. It's like, when you go through life crisis situations, whether you're grieving over this or that, you may not eat. But you have to know that if you continue to not eat, then you're putting yourself on the path of perdition. You're destroying yourself to a point where you may not be able to come back. And there's no boundary there. So yes, you may not eat, you may go through these struggles, but then you have to put a limit in the sense of, well, I can't go to this extent because it's going to harm myself. And somewhere along the line, I have to tell you that you have to have the motivation for yourself. And that's the difficulty, that a lot of times that's a journey that is, you're on your own with it. And so the crisis of faith of Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, he had that motivation. And he sought and he struggled. You know what I'm saying? He went through the breakdown, but there was still a motivation for life, for trying to figure things out. And he went through his journey of trying to figure things out. And that's why he's considered a model in these regards. He went through a journey of trying to work things out. And it's quite different. Because Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, one thing that he had was supports around him. He was a person that was of standing. So a person of standing has different resources than a person that doesn't have that standing. That's something to be focused on. So when you don't have those resources, that becomes the question of what do you do? And sometimes when you don't have the motivation, that becomes the question of what do you do? And you have to realize that if you give up on yourself, then you're really losing in the battle, because you don't have that support that others may have. You don't have those resources that others may have. And you yourself are counting on yourself. Pay attention to that. To get yourself out of the struggle. Of course, you're depending upon Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. But if you don't get out of that bed because depression has hit you, then it becomes an issue. And we live in a world that's cold. And I'm not talking about temperature-wise. There's a world in which if people don't see you motivated at times, they won't be there to necessarily support you. You have to realize that. Sometimes if you're in a relationship crisis, if you're going through the crisis on your own and you're emitting a certain type of energy, that energy of despair and brokenness and this and that, is unfortunate, but there may not be empathy there. There's a repulsion that takes place sometimes when certain emotions are in place. That's why there has to be a motivation for the self. So there has to be a limit that we put to the crisis of faith and the crisis of struggle and situation. And necessarily, it doesn't have to be when others demand it, but somewhere in your mind, you have to intend that I can't go beyond this point. I have to fight for myself. I have to fight for my well-being. And that's something that's not really talked about much in the literature, because today we have people that they become suicidal in their thinking. They tend to harm themselves emotionally. They go through negative ideation. Negative ideation is when there's a series of thoughts which constantly occupy the mind, which are negative. You have to realize that one of the challenges that we have is that disconnectedness from the Quran, that disconnectedness from the dhikr of Allah. And that's why some people recommend ibadah. That's why they say that. They recommend ibadah. Because what it does is it begins to preoccupy you and distract you from your struggle. And what it does is it fills your mind and your heart with other thinking, other thoughts. What it does is it begins to renew in you a sense of hope. And that's something that's clear. The average Muslim understands if I go through X struggle or Y struggle or Z struggle, then I need to check my relationship with Allah. But this is not really addressed to that average Muslim that does that. This is addressed to those who hit rock bottom and it seems like nothing is working. Right? So the crisis of faith in and of itself is not a problem. The problem is how we deal with it. And really at the core of that, the core becomes, are we giving up on ourselves? The Quran looks down upon the concept of qunut. And qunut is shadidu yes, is a profound despair which is destabilizing. That in itself is the issue, right? That in itself is an issue. And that's why we said there has to be a boundary. It's one thing to have a sense of despair. It's another thing where you collapse into despair so much that it kills hope. Hope has to be there. Hope has to be there. And some situations are bad. Positive thinking is not going to get you out of that. Some situations are really messed up. And that's why, looking is important. Doing for yourself is important. And seeking the lifeline is important. And I mentioned this before in other lives, other Facebook lives, that you have to build a network around yourself. And that's why in this society, there's hotlines, there's this, there's that. They may not always work, but at least it gives you a moment where you can reach out. You see what I'm saying? It gives you a moment where you can reach out, and that person may put you in contact with another person in which you have to keep fighting in that regard, because it becomes an issue of spiritual mental survival if you're at a point where you're at complete breakdown. But there's certain things that you have to put out for yourself. It's like you can't despair to a point where nothing seems to help you at all. You have to have some sense of relief somewhere. And that's why people say turning to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. And so I end with saying that sometimes, even in your turning to Allah, you may struggle. But shoot that dua to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Make that effort as much as you can. And between those two poles, mujahidah, and this is what we call real jihad, that you're really sacrificing and you're struggling and you're striving and you're putting all your effort and you just can't anymore at a certain point. Between that and reaching out to Allah and the issue of waiting through the moment, you're released. You're released. Time is something that a lot of us don't like to confront. We know that there's some wounds that are only healed by time. And that's the same thing with the spiritual life. There's some states that we can only work through them by time. Is when Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala releases us. But it's the coping that we're focusing on here. How do we cope? That's why we said it's the spiritual crisis in and of itself is not an issue. The problem more is how do we deal with it? And we're not focusing on those who seem to have spiritual recipes on how they get out of their struggles. We're talking about those who are really going through deep struggles and they're alone in that struggle. And nothing that they do seems to work. And they find that they hit a brick wall. We have to realize that's a human experience that some go through that you can identify with. So at the end of the day, we close on that note of saying, you have to strive for yourself to a certain extent. You have to try. You have to find that motivation, that routine. You have to find that dua that you're at least comfortable with. You have to do little steps, little things for yourself. And that makes it a little easier for others to help you. But then also you have to let others come into your world. But it's impossible, to think that you won't get any help if you let others come in. It may not be what you want or what you need at the moment, but that's part of also doing for yourself. You let others come into your world. The crisis of faith in and of itself is not a problem. The problem is how is it that we deal with it? And so sometimes, we have to realize that madness is constantly trying to do things the same way and desiring a different result. So when we see that we're going the wrong route, sometimes we may have to realize that we have to change course. And isn't that wanting to change the course, or knowing that the course has to be changed, but not being able to desire it or not having the motivation to do it, that is where a lot of people confront emotions which are overwhelming. And that's where it's the step-by-step process. Take baby steps. You're not alone in human suffering. That doesn't mean that your suffering is not unique and your situation is not real. That doesn't mean that you're not valid. But it just means that, you know, there's other people that can identify with you. And if you take baby steps and you reach out, you'll find that there'll be people that can identify with you. It may not be in the circle that you may think. It may not be the way that you think. You know, but that's something that is key. Make a list of your strengths. And even if you don't find anything but half a strength, build around that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.